Write down all the things that demand your time and attention every day.
Mm-hmm.
Ask yourself how many of those things are actually helping you achieve more of the goal that you've set. And typically 80% of that stuff just takes up time and capacity and don't help directly. So step 2 of deciding how to better exploit the constraint is normally decide what can we stop doing.
Hi, everyone. Eugene Shatsman here, your host for the Power Hour podcast. We've got an amazing episode for you today. By the way, we're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and I hope that you can subscribe so that you get updates every time that we publish something. So in today's episode, I bring on the world's leading decision scientist and theory of constraints expert. Dr. Alan Barnard leads Goldratt Research Labs. If you've ever read the book The Goal, which I did, and it's basically the optimizer's Bible, Dr. Barnard's business partner was the late Eli Goldratt, who wrote that book. So Alan helps organizations all over the world make better and faster decisions. He has worked with some really impressive organizations. He has been hired by governments, Fortune 500 companies like Nike, ABB, Cisco, Intel, the list goes on. He's a really impressive guy. And in the first few minutes of today's episode, he lists out a framework that can be used to optimize just about anything in our business and even our lives. He just says it so casually, but the truth is you may have to slow it down to like 1x and then listen to it again if you're really trying to apply this. It's so profound. And then we spend some time going through some examples and trying to do some thought experiments in the optometry space. So I think the other two impactful parts of the episode that you're going to want to hear, number one is Dr. Barnard mathematically proves how multitasking is a huge productivity drain and why it's so counterintuitive. I actually really can't wait to share this with all of my staff and kind of show them the model that he lays out. And perhaps my favorite part of the episode is when he tells us about his technique for tricking the mind into starting to achieve what seems completely out of reach or impossible. Anyway, Alan is a world-class expert, and I'm excited to get into today's episode. But before we do, I just want to strongly urge you to please share your feedback with me. If you're listening, I truly enjoy hearing from our listeners. I love getting the emails. I'm happy to answer questions, brainstorm ideas for show guests, and just overall, I appreciate the feedback, and I appreciate the support. Please reach out to me on eugeneshatsman.com or on the Power Hour website. I love hearing how we can continue to evolve the show to be the best possible resource for you. Okay, and with that, let's go to today's conversation. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Power Hour, and I am so excited. We have an incredible guest. With me today is Dr. Alan Barnard. He is the world's leading decision scientist. He is the guy who helps figure out why good people sometimes make bad decisions over and over again. He is known as the world's foremost authority on the theory of constraints. And I know we have so many interesting topics to cover. His advice, by the way, I think at one point in my career, he gave me about an hour of advice, and it truly transformed my perspective and my business. And so I'm just so grateful and so excited to have you on the show, Alan. Thank you for joining me.
You are very welcome, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, so I know you have a lot of value for our listeners today. Let's start with the first question, which I think will help contextualize your expertise for people. Talk a little bit about what theory of constraints is and why it's important.
Awesome. I think any person that is either a manager or an owner of a business knows that it's critical to always know what's the one thing to focus on that can make a big difference. And that's really hard to find. What is that one thing? Because there's so many things, that demand our attention, so many problems and opportunities.
Sure.
Theory of constraints is really just a systems approach for finding out what that one thing is. And it's on a one part is beautifully simple. It says that the strength of any chain is determined by the weakest link.
Mm-hmm.
That weakest link is the bottleneck or the constraint. And if you can find and strengthen that weakest link, you're making the whole system stronger. You're making it perform better. Whatever the goal is of that system, whether it's an impact goal or a profit goal, doesn't matter. And it also doesn't matter whether your chain has got just 3 links in it. It's a simple little business, simple process that a patient goes through, for example, as an optometrist, or It's a massively complex system that might have 300 links. There's only one weakest link at any point in time.
Yeah.
So that's at the very simple way of thinking about it as, what should I focus on? Find and focus on the constraint.
Yeah, and maybe you can give a couple examples of how the type of work that you do as a decision scientist and as a theory of constraints expert.
Yes. So when you're thinking about a system, and that's another sort of reference to be useful, is when I'm thinking about a system normally contains 5 parts, right? There's the goal of the system, either impact or income goal, but that goal then dictates what work I have to do. Do I provide products or services or combination? That's the second part. The third part is, what resources do I need to do the work to achieve the goal? But the goal determines how much of every resource I need. And this is where the idea of a constraint comes in, is that a constraint is simply a resource that I don't have enough of to achieve the goal. So I might have set the goal to, create a business that makes $1 million a year, right? So what resources do I need? Well, there's 5 resources that can be constraints. The first one is, I don't have enough demand to achieve the goal, right? Okay, that becomes the one thing. If I don't have demand, I need to
focus on getting more demand. Yes.
Yeah, right. What if I have enough demand? Then this next resource I need that can be a constraint is, I have enough demand, but I don't have enough capacity to reliably deliver that demand, to meet the demand within the tolerance time of the customers, right? So again, if that's the constraint, then that's the one thing to focus on. It can also be external resources, which is a supply constraint, right? Either human resources or parts or components or etc. That would be a supply constraint. Again, if that's a constraint, that's the one thing to focus on. Make sure that that's not constraining you from meeting your goal. If it's not supplied, could also be cash. I have enough demand, enough capacity and supply, but I just don't have enough cash to get enough of the others. And then the last one that took us a long time to figure out, like, what else could become a constraint, is management attention. Right? That's our ultimate constraint for most of us, is even if we have enough demand, capacity, supply, and cash, we might have a management attention constraint. And that's why theory of constraints is so important, because there's always so many things that demand our attention. What's the one or few things we focus on? And that's why theory of constraints is so profoundly important. So just as a summary, so a system has a goal. The goal determines the work we have to do. It determines the resources that we need. But we also have to decide what's the rules that we're going to use to manage the work and the resources. And that's where decision science comes in, is we have different types of decisions we make when we're setting up a business. We have to decide how to design that business, right? So if it's a simple practice, where am I going to put the practice? If I have a chain, where do I put all the practices? Maybe I also have a distribution center that supplies. So any design decisions, how do I make that decision to be the most profitable? There's also planning decisions I have to make before I do the work. What lead times do I quote customers, etc. There's execution improvement decisions, and that's where decision science comes in, is knowing what is the best decision for the system, not for a part of the system, because that could result in local optimization. And then the last part of a system, we have the goal, we have the work, the resources, the rules, is the metrics. There's sort of 3 metrics that's important. It's the lag metrics. Typically for businesses, are we making money? Are we getting a return on investment? There's the lead metrics, which is what percentage of our customers are we able to serve within their tolerance time, for example, right? What is the throughput that I'm getting? What is the quality that I'm doing? These are all lead metrics. But another important one that most businesses don't measure is compliance metrics. This is essentially we agreed on the rules to optimize the system. Are we following the rules?
Mm-hmm.
Don't follow the rules and we don't get the performance, we will never know. Is it because we have the wrong rules or because we just don't always follow the rules? So that to me is a useful framework, and it shows the link between me as a decision scientist have to figure out what are the rules to use to manage the whole system versus theory of constraint, which is where to focus all my limited attention on.
Okay, this is a phenomenal, this just the last 3 minutes of you talking is just so much information, because if you slow down, back up and re-listen to that, Alan has said so much. But, before we take some of this and apply it to optometry, before we take this framework and apply it to optometry, people have been asking me, to bring in experts from outside of the optometric space and industry. And again, as the world's leading decision scientist and the most renowned expert on theory of constraints, you've obviously worked on really meaningful projects. Give us a couple examples, maybe on various ends of the spectrum, some projects that you've worked on outside of optometry before we bring it in and start applying it to our industry.
So we've had the privilege of working across many different industries, many different sizes of business. So Microsoft was one opportunity. They came to us and said, most people don't realize, but they obviously don't only supply software, they supply amazing physical products.
Mm-hmm.
Houses, keyboards, smartphones, Surface Pro computers, even HoloLens, right? And they wanted to design a supply chain that will be reliable, effective, efficient, profitable, and I wanted my help to do that. And we worked with them to design a solution. We tested the solution by building a full simulation model of that whole supply chain to test what are the best rules to maximize that supply chain performance. From start to end, getting those rules implemented into the SAP system took us only 3 months.
Well, so what were they? What major changes did you make?
So there were a couple of changes. So if you think about the criteria for success for supply chain would be, for example, that you don't have too much or too little inventory at the points where your customers are buying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have obviously points at the distribution center level where you could have a shortage or surplus, but also at the retail level. At the retail, it's more devastating because there you lose sales if you have too little. You lose space and cash if you have too much. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to check that whole supply chain. And one of the things that we realized was that every link was placing orders that were too large and too infrequent. And then they would either be stuck with too much stock or have too little stock because the supply chain is now filled up with stuff that's not needed now. So we tested that as a change in the rules. Rather than ordering larger quantities less frequently to secure discounts, place smaller quantities more frequently and get a discount based on the total volume you order rather than on every individual order. That simple change, there was a few other changes, which is never to pre-allocate stock to customers, etc. But in the same financial year that we started, Eugene, they got their inventories down by $250 million and got sales up by a few $100 million. Wow. So the lag measurement there was obviously sales, revenue, and profitability and inventory. The lead measurement was not having shortages and surpluses, right?
No.
That was what we've performed. To ensure the compliance part to it, we implemented those rules, those new rules into their SAP system to ensure full automation and 100% compliance. So that's on the one extreme side.
That's one big business extreme side. What's another one?
Another one was working with Utah state government, right? Okay. They have 24 government agencies.
Wait. I'm just, hold on. The government hired a theory of constraints expert to become more efficient.
They did, but there's an incredible person by the name of Kristen Cox that was executive director of one of their agencies. And she learned about theory of constraints and applied it to her own agency and got unbelievable results. Cleared the backlog, dramatically reduced the supply lead time, increased the throughput. And then as a result, she was asked to head up the governor's office to go and implement this across all 24 agencies.
Okay,
And
so you get hired by the state of Utah to do what?
To help the governor's office that was led by Kristen Cox to implement theory of constraints across all the government agencies.
Okay.
And the lead measurement for them was, we want to show our citizens that every dollar we're spending of their tax money has got a return, right? And they wanted to show that they can improve the productivity of every agency by 25%.
They can improve the productivity of every government agency by 25%.
Yes, that was the minimum standard. The first problem was, I asked them, how are you going to measure productivity? And very quickly it came down to the fact that there was already a backlash from the agency directors, because for them, what do you think improved productivity means? It means less budget. And they say, we're already not meeting, our customers' tolerance times, and there's backlog building, and we can't take a budget cut. We said, no, that's not what a productivity measurement. Productivity can be measured by QT over OE. Quality times throughput over operating expenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So throughput is, am I meeting the demand that's placed on my agency? It has an upper limit where I'm meeting the demand. If I'm not meeting the demand, there will be a backlog of customers now waiting for my agency, right? So that was our first objective with them. How do we go faster up to the point where we can fully meet the demand?
Mm-hmm.
The quality aspect is, okay, you're meeting the demand, but are you meeting the expectations of all the customers? That's the quality aspect.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of their expectations are you meeting? Is it 80%, 90%, etc.? To achieve that, we wanted to do better. And then the last part, which is below the line, the operating expenses, is how to do it cheaper. And we said that it's that equation, quality throughput over operating expenses, that determines your productivity. And we wanted to see a minimum improvement of those three variables of at least 25%.
Okay, so what did you get the government to do? Because governments are not really known for their ability to change efficiently. Right.
So an important part of the buy-in was to say, this doesn't mean we're going to cut budgets by 25%. We want you to implement a few changes, typically focused on your bottleneck area, right? Because government tend to not have a demand problem, right? The constraint is either in capacity or supply or cash. It's budget, right? And of course, also in management attention. So we essentially designed 3 workshops, training people how to go faster, how to shorten the lead time, training them how to do it better to improve quality, and then 3rd workshop, how to do it cheaper. And they had a target of achieving that within 3 years. Within the first year, they were already hitting the productivity improvement targets of 25% or more.
Okay, but
that's another case on the other side of complexity, but for a government agency or NGO.
But it sounds like the core pattern is find the thing that's least efficient in that's the biggest bottleneck in your business, and give it the attention that it needs in order to succeed. And sometimes you don't even know that that's right. The thing that's least efficient, or that needs the most amount of attention in your business, right?
I think one thing that is important to know is, it's also one of the lessons that the marketing guru, Jay Abraham, that you know very well, teaches, right? Is step 0 is defining your goal clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very clearly. Step 1 then is identify the constraint to achieving that goal. Is it not enough demand, capacity, supply, cash, or management attention? Step 2 is don't get more of it. Right, that's the natural tendency. Okay, now we don't have enough salespeople. Let's get more salespeople. We don't have enough inventory. Let's get more inventory. We don't have enough. Let's get more. That's only step 4 in the process. Step 2 in the process is decide how to better exploit and not waste that scarce resource, right? And a simple example that I hope everybody could relate to, imagine if you are the bottleneck in your business, which is probably most likely the case, especially if you have a small business, right? Write down all the things that demand your time and attention every day. Ask yourself how many of those things are actually helping you achieve more of the goal that you've set. And typically 80% of that stuff just takes up time and capacity and don't help directly. So step 2 of deciding how to better exploit the constraint is normally decide what can we stop doing. And that was true also for Microsoft, for Utah, and even for small businesses. That step 2, once I've identified the constraint, is to say, what can I stop doing that's wasting this scarce resource, whether it's the market, capacity, supply, or cash or management attention. That normally will give you more opportunity. Step 3 says subordinate everything to that decision. Any policy or measurement that's in conflict, go and change it. If it's still not enough, then go to step 4, which is now get more, elevate the constraint, hire more people, get more machines, add inventory, secure more cash. And then step 5, to make it a process of ongoing improvement, is if you've broken a constraint in the previous step, go back to step 1. Don't let inertia become your constraint.
Interesting. So, let's apply it now to a typical business in the optometric space, right? And the way I want to think about this, Alan, is, why don't you ask me some questions and see if we can identify just a typical example of a constraint. Right. And I'll pick. We have lots of clients in the optometric industry with a wide variety of challenges, depending on the phase of where their practice is. So, let's play it out. How can we help?
So the first question would be to them: do you have a clear goal? And your goal could be income or impact or combination of these two. But do you have an absolutely clear goal that you're after? What do you want to achieve by when? Who will benefit?
Okay, so let's say I want to take $1 million practice to a $1.5 million practice. I want to grow by 50% in 2 years.
Great. So then the question will be, now that you know that very clearly, can you do some calculations considering the products or services that you provide? You know what the selling prices are. How many additional product or services do you need to sell in order to achieve that goal of a 50% growth in revenue? And assuming that you've done that calculation, then the question will be, step 1, what is the constraint? Where's the constraint going to be? Do you have enough demand? Or do you have enough capacity, supply, cash, or management attention? Those are your options, right? What is the weakest link or the constraint to achieving that 1.5 million in revenue?
Well, so some people will start with a product. This is where I'm going to challenge, try to figure out the thinking a little bit. But let's say I want to go from a $1 million practice to a $1.5 million practice. There's a chance that I have to add an optometrist. An optometrist is a very scarce resource. Those folks are busy and they're expensive and they're not always available for hire, right? So it's, let's say I want to grow, but I don't have an optometrist. So my capacity is the one optometrist I have right now, or maybe the 2 optometrists I have right now.
Right. And again, you see, which is a great answer, but that shows the common mistake of jumping to step 4, which is elevating the constraint, right? Going to get more. We first want to check, do you have a demand constraint? You're currently at $1 million. And a way to check if you have a bottleneck is there a backlog?
Okay. So let's say I do have a waiting list. Maybe the patients are waiting 3 or 4 weeks to see me.
Exactly. And it might be that backlog is now longer than the tolerance time of customers, right?
Okay.
So you can see how that will change everything. If I have a demand constraint, I have to essentially create an offer out there that will get me more customers. But maybe my offer is already good enough. I just don't have enough capacity. Then don't make the mistake of immediately hiring another optometrist. First, look at how can we not waste the capacity that we've got. So now your optometrist you've identified as a bottleneck.
Mhm.
And what you want to do is, of the 8 hours or 9 hours or 10 hours that that person is working every day, how much of the capacity is lost by doing work that is either not needed, number one,
Mhm.
not really needed, right, to achieve the goal, not needed now, can be done by somebody else
Mhm.
and be automated.
Okay.
Those are all the opportunities that could save you time. And our experience is that minimum, you will probably save 20% time, minimum. It is not unheard of to find out that 50% of the time is being wasted in one of those 4 categories. Now, why that is so profound is, remember, to achieve our goal, we just need to increase our output by 50%, right?
Mhm.
Assuming we'll sell the same products and services at about the same selling price, right?
Mhm.
If I'm exposing that my optometrist is losing 50% of their time and I could get that back, I could theoretically double my output. And I only need to increase it by 50%. So that will also leave me some buffer that I need to deal with emergency cases, etc. So that's the practical application of it. Is we are so tempted to say, oh my goodness, I've set this very stretched target. Probably I need more resources. No, first look at, are you really utilizing the resources that you've got? Because if you don't, then by adding more resources, you'll just waste more.
Well, and I think you sometimes, and this could get really complex really fast, but we could talk about how, well, are you really offering the same product to the same patient? Because if a typical eye exam, let's say my optometrist is busy, I have a perception that my optometrist is busy. They show up, they see a patient every 30 minutes, or let's just call it 20 minutes. They see a patient every 20 minutes. They see as many patients as we can possibly cram in to they see 18 patients a day, Alan. That's a busy optometrist, right? That's so many times people will say, I want to have an optometrist who sees, I don't know, 14, 15 patients a day, but let's say mine sees 18. My question is, should they be, and this is maybe a little controversial for our audience, but should every eye exam be the same type of eye exam? If it's, if the output may not be the same for every single patient?
A great question. So I mentioned that step 2 of the theory of constraints is, so you've identified the constraint, which in this case could be the optometrist. Step 2 is decide how to exploit it and not waste it.
Mhm.
There's 2 ways of better exploiting it. I've covered the one, which is stop doing all the things that wasted time.
Mhm.
Right? But there's another aspect to it, which is about money. There's a basic law of economics that's very interesting that most business owners are not aware of, is that you profit maximize not when you produce the products or services with the highest margin,
Mhm.
but with the highest margin per scarce resource time unit. So, for example, if I have 2 services that I offer, right, and one is making me 30% gross margin, and the other one 50% gross margin, I might be tempted that if I have enough demand for both, that I will push the one that makes me 50% margin. What I should do is I should say, how much dollars per hour of my constraint is it generating? Right? That's what will profit maximize. So you might find that the one that's giving you 50% gross margin is only making you $50 an hour, whereas the one that's giving you 30% gross margin might be making you $100 an hour.
Mhm.
But that's the second recommendation to the business owners out there, the optometrists, is to go and do the calculations, which is basically for every product or service they provide, calculate what the gross margin is, which is essentially your selling price less total variable cost, no allocated overhead, just total variable cost. That's your gross margin in dollars, and divide it by the time it takes on your bottleneck. And then sort it and see what does that tell you. And what if you could switch to providing more of the products that will give you the highest gross margin per bottleneck time? That can almost always double your profitability, sometimes 5x your profitability just by doing that.
And that's why I think many practices look at specialty services outside of just an exam and then I sell glasses. It could be an exam and then there's a specialty service that's then operated by a tech in the office and doesn't require the doctor's time, but could have a substantial amount of revenue for the practice as a result of that.
And that's an important part, because when you're thinking about it, our return on investment, right? What does that mean? It means the return part is the gross margin the product or service is generating. The investment is not the cash investment. It's the investment of bottleneck capacity, right? So if I could find a product or service that requires zero bottleneck capacity, what's the ROI? It's infinite, right? Does it make sense?
It
but
does.
People don't think about that, right? So that becomes once you're in this mode of, I've identified the constraint, and sometimes it's not just the optometrist, sometimes it's something as ridiculous as a technician or the reception, right? Or the lab, right? Those things you don't want to constrain your business.
Well, and it's silly, right? Alan, I in thinking about how we track marketing services that my company provides, one of the things that we do is we listen to phone calls that come in. And one of the stupidest constraints that practices sometimes have is they just don't have the staff to answer the phone. That becomes your most scarce resource. But I mean, in the industry, across average, and I don't know if people will be surprised by this number, but on average, during business hours, optometry practices, on average, answer 75% of phone calls.
Right.
That means 25% of phone calls just get wasted, right? And you hope they leave a voicemail, but some percentage of them won't, especially the new patients. They're going to go look somewhere else. But that's a silly bottleneck that we almost create because we want to be efficient. We want to say, well, I don't need two people at the front desk. It's going to cost me more money. But how do you get out of that mindset?
Yeah. And that's a great question. So again, something that's very counterintuitive. So imagine my business really just have two problems. We don't have enough demand, right? Or we have too much. What does too much look like? So imagine as an optometrist, all your work can be put together as one-day tasks, right? And you go to an optometrist and you say, how long will it take you to do this one-day task? The right answer is it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on your busyness or utilization. So if that optometrist is doing nothing else, it will take them one day to complete the one-day task. Let's say somebody's coming for a complete new set of, teeth, right? It's, the technology has or a complete change in the eyeglasses that they wear. The whole thing can be maybe done in a day, right? It's okay. If I was not doing anything else, it would take me a day. But what if I'm already 50% busy? Then it would take 2 days because half of my time is already taken up and I do these one-day tasks. If I'm 80% busy, it'll be 5 days to do the one-day task. If I'm 90% busy, it'll take me 10 days to get to the one-day task and complete it. But if I'm 99% busy, it'll take me 100 days to get that one-day task done. And what you'll notice is that initially the time it takes me to get the one-day task done grows linearly. And then after 80%, it grows exponentially. So that's an important reference to keep in mind that says, what does too much demand mean? It means that I'm loading my resources more than 80%.
Okay.
And that's the important part, because now the work, which in this case is the customers that want and need my service, are starting to wait too long and they give up, and we're losing a lot of potential. So that's an important thing, is to monitor the utilization, not just of the optometrist, but of all the supporting resources, and make sure you stay away from more than 80% utilization.
Yeah. So, Alan, I think what you were trying to get at with that one-day task explanation is this concept of multitasking, which I know you've studied a lot. So I actually want to zoom in on that one more time, and let's let's make it a project. Let's make it a project that all of us work on projects, and let's make it as simple as, I don't know, like let's pick a household project. Yeah, like just like a household project. I have to, I don't know, clean out my garage. It's going to take me 4 hours. Right. Should I multitask or should I not multitask?
Right. So say what makes it different is whether I'm only doing one thing or multiple things, right? So if I'm doing one thing, the sooner I start it, the sooner I finish it. So if I only had that 1 4-hour thing to do, the sooner I start, the sooner I finish. But what if I have 2 things to do or 3 things? So as a simple example, just imagine you are doing a project that would take 10 days. Okay. We've got 3 of these projects, right? And you have 2 ways of doing them. You can do project 1, then 2, then 3.
Okay. So 10 days each. So each project is 10 days?
Yeah, each project is 10 days. So project 1 will take you 10 days, so you'll finish at that time 10. Project 2, you start at day 11, you'll finish at day 20. Project 3, you start at day 21, you finish at day 30. That's if you get one project at a time. But what do? We multitask, which means we switch, right? Because each project potentially has a different customer or owner, and they all want you to give them your highest priority. So what do? We do a day of work, maybe on project 1, then we switch to a day of work on project 2, and then a day of work on project 3. In the theoretical best case, even if there's no switching cost, right? Switching cost is trying to figure out where the hell was I on this project, and secondly, having to report progress, right? But assume there's no switching cost, it will still take me 30 days to complete all 3 projects. But project 1, I will complete on day 27, right? Start day 28. Project 2 on day 29, project 3 on day 30. So my highest priority project of project 1, the time to complete that has gone from 10 days to almost 30 days.
So nobody wins.
Nobody wins. But this is when theoretically there's no switching cost. When there is switching cost, that will typically take me 60 days to do those same 3 projects.
Because every time I have to pick something up, I'm thinking,
where the hell was I? Right. And now I have to report progress at the end of it, right? So that's the problem, is I'm now taking double the amount of time, which means I can only get half of the amount of work done, right? And because I'm so under pressure, I'm constantly in chaotic mode, switching, I make many more mistakes. Now, here's going back to what was my assumption that's causing me to multitask. The assumption is that the sooner I start, the sooner I finish. Absolutely true if I'm doing one thing. Completely false if I'm doing 2 or more things. So think about project 2 in the multitasking, right? If I was multitasking, I would have started the project on day 2 and I would have finished it on day 59, right? If I'm single tasking, I started on day 11, I finish it on day 20. Wow. The later I start, the sooner I finish. Massively counterintuitive, even counterinstinctful, and that's why we all multitask. It's not just that we are chasing this shiny object. We actually think it's better to multitask because the sooner I start, the sooner I finish. And also our customers think the same way. We have to do the exact opposite. And that's another way where the bottleneck is losing a lot of capacity by multitasking. That optometrists that are constantly switching from one activity to the other. So if you could find a way of outsourcing everything that doesn't involve the skill that only the optometrists have got. I helped to implement one case study that I can share is I helped to implement this in my own optometrist practice.
Really?
And they doubled the throughput.
Okay, tell me, what did you do?
Basically, what we said is that optometrist should be spending the majority of the 8 hours on only doing the work that they are qualified to do. Everything else should be prepared for them, right? So I'm coming in as a patient. I'm going through the reception area into the waiting area. I'm going to sit in the chair. A technician comes along. They do the preparation for me. And I have 3 of these rooms. And all that the optometrists do is once they get the go-ahead from the technician that the patient is now ready, there's a full kit, what we call full kitting, right? Everything is done. The patient is now waiting for the optometrist. The optometrist comes in, do their part, and as soon as they're done, they move to the next patient. And the technician comes in and finishes it off. So
and I think a lot of people who, I think this is an intuitive bottleneck, right? Because we think a lot about our resources associated with the OD, the optometrist time. There's also a bunch of non-intuitive bottlenecks that occupy a practice. I know that when you talked about inventory, in Microsoft example, I immediately went to, well, every single optometric office is also a retail facility with inventory, right? They've got anything from 500, 1,000 potentially different pairs of frames on the frame board, and that in itself can become a bottleneck, right?
Right. So there, the problem is having too much of stuff that's not selling and having too little of the stuff that is selling. Now,
and to your point, how often are you how often are you refreshing that inventory? Because I wrote down as soon as you said it, smaller quantities more often for Microsoft. I was like, well, how often are we buying frames? And are we doing that once a month? Are we doing that once a day? Probably not once a day. And if we're doing it once a month, we probably know that's too infrequent. But how do we replenish the inventory that we've sold?
Yeah, I'll give an example of how bad it can get. We were working with one of the biggest book retailers in the world, right? And we were very interested to find out that the average sales velocity of a book in a retailer is 1 a year.
Is what? It's a year?
1 per year.
Wow. Okay.
1 per year, right? It's a little bit more like 1.5. So they're doing inventory turns of under 2 per year.
Wow. Okay.
Because there's so many books, right? Now, some you can imagine sell 10 copies a day if it's a bestseller. So what we looked at was to say, where are the biggest opportunity? Where are they making bad decisions? And it turns out that the first order quantity that they place on the publisher, in 86% of the cases, the first order quantity is more than the lifetime sale of the book.
Wow.
And we said, why is this? And I said, well, the first order, we tried to forecast what will be our sales in the next 3 months. And then we place an order. I said, why 3 months? Oh, we've always done it that way. Now, you can imagine the two extremes, right? Is that in 86% of the cases, their forecast of what will sell in the first 3 months, they never reach that number over the whole lifetime of the book.
Wow. Okay.
And that's the same with probably glasses, the same thing, right? You try to come up how much of this thing will we sell in 3 months, and you place an order on it, right? It turns out that in most cases, you never sell that, ever. Whereas others, you say, well, I think we'll sell 2 a month, so let's order 6. And then you sell 6 in the first week, right? But you have a policy that says, I'm only going to be reviewing and checking my inventories maybe once a month or whatever. So it's exactly what you said, is just getting into the mind shift of saying, let's order smaller quantities more frequently. So if we've ordered too much, we don't get stuck with a lot. And if we order too little, we can quickly fix our mistake and start ordering more.
And the natural pushback you're going to get from someone as well, but then I'm going to be spending more money on shipping costs. What is the real cost of the wrong thing sitting on your shelf for too long?
Well, and it's on top of that is what we found out, again, in the case of the book retailers, right? They can get deliveries almost every day. So it's not guaranteed that the costs will actually go up. You want to check, how am I paying for shipping cost, right? And maybe that the supplier that you're buying it from can deliver more frequently. You might say, well, at least let's get to weekly deliveries, right, rather than monthly deliveries. And maybe the cost doesn't go up. Maybe the cost even comes down because they can use smaller vehicles to ship more frequently. So it's all these type of things. Is like if managing inventory is one of the major leverage points, is you want to see how can I best do that.
That's interesting. So, I think there's a lot of really cool concepts here. The one thing that I think you and I share is this mindset of, there's always opportunities to grow a business. And there's ways that you can dramatically increase what somebody is doing inside of their business by really just looking at it in a more strategic way. And you do this from a perspective of bottlenecks and constraints. So talk a little bit about that for just a moment.
Yes, there's obviously ways that we can find, once we know if I have a capacity constraint or supply constraint or even cash constraint, first of all, how to stop wasting that capacity or supply or cash. But the other way of maximizing it is to think through the eyes of revenues, right? There are 3 things that Jay Abraham teaches in terms of how do I increase revenues. Get customers on average to pay more, or 1. Get them to buy more, number 2, or buy more frequently, number 3. What most people do is they underestimate the value of doing that. So imagine you have a practice that, say, does $1 million a year, like the example that you shared. And at the moment, you're only making 5% net profit. So you're making $50,000 a year after paying all the salaries. The question is, how much will you increase net profit by if you can get just 1% on average higher selling prices for the products or services that you provide? So 1% on $1 million is 10,000, right? You won't increase your variable cost. You won't increase OPEX. So that whole 10,000 will drop to the bottom line. So your profit will go from 50,000 to 60,000. That's
20% growth.
20% increase in net profit. For every 1%, you can increase the average selling price. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to raise the price. It might just mean reducing discounts, maybe, selling direct rather than through somebody else, etc. Or finding out which customers are time sensitive and not price sensitive.
Well, that's an interesting point. That was actually one fun conversation that you and I had before, which is talking about, well, if a practice is booked out for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, you said, well, that seems silly. Why wouldn't you just optimize for what people are willing to pay in terms of how quickly they want to be seen? And I said, well, I don't think that's really been done a lot in the optometric industry. Talk a little bit about that, Alan.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's this critical point. After more than 80% utilization, your lead times will go dramatically up, right? It will grow from the sort of that our example from 5 days to 100 days, right? So what do you do practically is you can keep 20% capacity and you can use that for time-sensitive customers. So what we would recommend to an optometrist, for example, is to say, don't schedule all 8 hours per day with appointments. Keep 20% of that capacity, or maybe if you want to be conservative, at least 10% of your capacity to deal with emergencies. But you have to charge a premium for that emergency. Why? For 2 reasons. First of all, you want to capitalize on the fact that it's an emergency and get a premium for it. But secondly, it's also a very reliable way of checking if it's really an emergency.
Yeah.
Because else everything is an emergency, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because there are some people where they'll think it's an emergency, but you would have to have a way to essentially get your customers to raise their, or to get your patients to raise their hand and say, yep, I'm willing to pay more to be seen sooner, and I'm not going to go look somewhere else.
Yeah, nobody's prepared to pay more or volunteer it. So what you do is, imagine this. You speak to your receptionist, somebody phones in, and they're asking for the first appointment with the optometrist.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at the book and they say, we can help you in 4 weeks' time. And the client says, 4 weeks? That's way too long. I really need my glasses. I'm going on an overseas trip. I need my eyes tested. I need glasses. You say, listen, the doctor does keep some space for emergencies. It's 50% more price for the appointment than normal. So you can decide. If you think it's worthwhile to pay the premium, I can in fact help you this afternoon or tomorrow. If it's not an emergency, you can wait until after the trip. Let's pencil you in for the 4 weeks. That's basically now separated between time sensitive versus price sensitive.
Exactly. That's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting perspective that I think, it would take somebody with a, it might take someone with a little bit of innovative mindset to try to figure out how to apply that to their practice. Alan, I want to end on one last point, which I think is such a powerful training that you do, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it. And it's this concept of of reaching impossible goals. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think of all the limiting assumptions or beliefs that we can have, both as a person but also as a business owner, is to think that something is impossible. Because not only we won't try it, but we won't even think about trying it. So the story here was I was working with a big mining company, and I had this goal that I had to achieve that seemed, when we asked them how you're going to do it, they said it's simply impossible, right? If we knew how, we would have done it. And my question to them was, it's impossible unless. And it does something very interesting to the brain. Now the brain goes into problem-solving mode, and it will find those conditions that can make the impossible possible. So how we apply this to practice, to businesses like optometrists, for example, is to say, that goal that you started off with, I want to grow my revenue from 1 million to 1.5 million. I would ask the business owner, do you think that that's possible? If they say yes, that will be a red flag for me. Why? Because whenever you think that something is realistic, right, it might not be easy, but you say, yeah, it's possible. It means that you think you already know how to achieve it, which means that you won't be open to think about any new ideas. So what I would encourage them to do is to say, either increase the target or reduce your time until you say, now it's impossible. So you could say, I want to achieve 1.5 million, not in 3 years, but in 1 year. Okay, now it's impossible. Or I want to make it 3 million. I want to double my revenue in 3 years. As soon as you say, now it's impossible, then you ask yourself, it's impossible unless. And
Mhm.
that will help you to identify those conditions that, if you put it in place, can make the impossible possible.
Yeah, it's an incredible mindset shift, and I've used this exercise, and I've also used it with my team. Yeah, we've looked at some of our BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, and we said, you know, yeah, that seems, and especially with frontline, as business owners, us visionaries tend to dream and we tend to live in the future. But you come to your team and you say, I want to double, and I want to do it, and people say, I can't do double the work. This is impossible. And then I literally did this exact exercise with my team about a year ago, where I wrote and I said, what's impossible? And then everybody kind of wrote in their department what was impossible. And then I said, unless, and then I wrote ... and then I wrote unless, exactly like you teach it, Alan. And I found that it forced people. First, people were kind of angry at me that, am I really this crazy? But then we got into this rhythm of conversation where people said, well, I guess if we did this and this, then, that might actually be something we could potentially accomplish. And I said, okay, great. Well, why are we doing this and this now? And that's when we got into this concept of, well, we could make a greater impact if we took this step. And you're absolutely right, as if you don't set an impossible goal, you'll just kind of cruise along, and it won't be enough to disrupt your typical flow, of how you're operating. But by setting the impossible goal, you're forcing everybody to think creatively about solutions that don't yet exist in your business.
Right. And I want to bring it back to that measurement that I recommended to Utah, because I think it's a great measurement for any organization, any business, is to think about your productivity of every department or every person can be measured by quality throughput over operating expenses, right?
Mhm.
Throughput is, am I meeting the demand that's placed on me as an individual or as a department? Am I achieving the right quality? And what's the total cost of me delivering that quality throughput? And for each of those, you can set an impossible target, right? You can say, it's impossible to do it in 1 hour because it's currently taking us 5 days to do it. And then you say it's impossible unless.
Mhm.
Impossible to improve quality from making, one mistake every 10 invoices to making one mistake every 1,000 invoices. It's impossible unless. It's impossible, to get it from it costing us $10 to costing us only $2. It's impossible unless.
Yeah, that's such a profound insight, Alan, into how we think as people and how we approach goal setting. So I'm super grateful for that, and for the conversation we've had so far today. We probably could keep this going for several hours, but let's save it for a few future shows once we get some feedback from our listeners. Any final parting thought that you want to leave the audience with?
No, I think just I hope that what I shared added value, and I know I shared a lot. So, that's the benefit of being able to do replays, right? To watch it again and again. And if anybody thinks that the insights are valuable, want to learn more, my social media handles are just Dr. Alan Barnard. I have a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, TikTok, X, all on Dr. Alan Barnard.
Yeah, and fantastic content, by the way, on your YouTube channel. I am a subscriber. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alan. I think this has been a phenomenal conversation. Grateful to have you on the show. And to our listeners, feel free to write in with your feedback as we continue to find guests from outside the industry to help you with your business and help you find untapped potential.
Thank you.
If you're enjoying the Power Hour, you might be asking yourself, what can I do today in my practice that's going to make an impact? So over the years, the practice coaches and consultants at the Power Practice have helped thousands of practices improve. And they often start with one thing, and that's a proprietary methodology called the Practice Profitability Audit. For about $2,400, they look at all of your practice numbers and they stack them up against where a practice of your size could and should be. It takes about a week for them to do. And because they're so experienced, they know what your potential looks like. And they're often able to take that $2,400, multiply it several times over, and hand it right back to you in found profits in your practice in months, not years, in months, but you get to keep the much more profitable practice for years afterwards. But here's the best news. I'm going to tell you how you can have the practice profitability audit completely free. See, we're really trying to get people onto the show website, which is, by the way, powerpractice.com. And then you click the Power Hour podcast button. The reason we want you there is because I want the audience participation. I want to hear your feedback, and I want to know how to make the show better for you. So you can interact with us, send us your feedback, offer your suggestions. And for a limited time, when you go there, you can also request a practice profitability audit for free. Right. We're going to cover 100% of the cost, but only for 5 people per month. And 5 people per month is all we really have capacity for, because this is a resource intensive audit and the power practice coaches are generally busy serving their clients. But for 5 people a month, they've agreed to cover 100% of the cost. So it's totally free to you. So again, take action immediately in your practice. Go to powerpractice.com, click on the Power Hour podcast, interact with us, but also request a practice profitability audit today.